Have you ever met someone with so many accomplishments you wondered how they possibly did all of them in one lifetime? Well, that pretty much sums up our guest today. Ralph Eubanks is a writer, a journalist, a teacher, amongst other things. He's from Mount Olive, Mississippi, and now he lives in Washington, D.C. But he's back in his home state for a short while, serving as an Eudora Welty Visiting Scholar at Millsaps College in Jackson. Ralph, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you again, too.
Yeah, I think the last time I saw you, you were flying past me in a 5K race.
I don't think it would be called flying past.
Well, in a Clydesdale kind of way.
Yes, in our big guy kind of way. Yes,
yeah,
Marshall.
I think you beat me by about 30 seconds in that race. So congratulations.
Well, thank you.
I lost that bet officially. So, but it's good to see you, and I'm so glad you're home. It's good to have you back.
It's good to be home, actually.
Yeah. And you know, I think so much of your journey is so fascinating, and I want to get you from the very beginning, because I think it's your family and their history has shaped who you are. But also, too, I want to get some of your perspectives of Mississippi today, because I think sometimes when you move away and you come back, you kind of get a different perspective that maybe we do being here in Mississippi.
I think that's actually what's happened to me coming back, and because my time back here is the first time I've lived here since 1978.
A little bit's changed since then.
A little bit has changed, but you know, there is something really comforting about coming back to Mississippi, because there are aspects of it that don't change, and you know, or we preserve things in a way. It's not like in California where things are torn down and something new is built up.
Right.
We do tend to keep things here. So there is a comforting familiarity when I run in downtown Jackson, and a lot of it really looks the same. I mean, the buildings may not be as occupied as they once were, but they're still there and they look the same, and that's comforting.
Well, talk about what you're doing now and you're doing here, because and we'll talk about all these parts of your career because they're amazing, but you're really doing something really cool here in Mississippi now.
Well, I am, and it's a real honor to be the Eudora Welty Scholar at Millsaps. Miss Welty is someone that I admire greatly.
Yeah.
And so that makes it a real honor, and I get to teach on a campus of a college that she really loved.
Mm-hmm.
I'm living in the same neighborhood that she lived in, and I walk over to school. I'm teaching 2 classes this semester, one in civil rights and literature that I call Must the Writer Crusade, which is based on her essay Must the Novelist Crusade, and the other photography and literature, also inspired by Miss Welty because of her work as a photographer. She referred to her photographs as snapshots, but I believe they really fit much more in the tradition now of the postmodern tradition of art, which is how we think of photography now. But I don't think that she thought of it that way when she was taking them.
She was such an incredible storyteller. She could tell it both visually and with the written word. It just was phenomenal.
And so much of it she did from memory. Her story, A Pageant of Birds, is one that I always thought that she worked from the photographs, which is what I have to do. If I'm writing about photography, I have to have the photographs in front of me. But even after she took those and she wrote the story, she wrote it from memory. She didn't write it from using the photographs in front of her.
That's incredible. Talk about the interaction with the students, because that has to be incredibly rewarding in itself.
It is, and what I'm really enjoying about that is there are aspects of my life and career that I'm getting to share with them in my photography and literature class. All the books that I did from all my years at the Library of Congress, working in the photography collection, talking about what it takes to be a photo editor, thinking about that interplay between language and the visual. And then in my civil rights and literature class, using some of my knowledge of the civil rights movement to think about how it all fits in with the literary tradition. And I think the other really fun thing I got to do, well, it was fun. I thought I was actually advising on a play for Black History Month that was called Negro Necropolis, bringing people from African American history back from the dead to talk about it. And I thought I was advising, and one of my students said, "You quoted Langston Hughes in our class yesterday. Why did you play Langston Hughes?" So I had to play Langston Hughes.
Well, how did it go?
It went fine.
You think a Tony might be in the works?
No, that's not going to happen. Okay. But I did I did try to look like Langston Hughes did as a busboy. I was imagining him as a busboy, slipping his poems under the plate of Vachel Lindsay in the Wardman Hotel in Washington, D.C.
You and Steve McNair, Mount Olive. I mean, what a great combination. But you come from Mount Olive, Mississippi. And
Yes.
you grew up, I guess, in a turbulent time in Mississippi in the late 50s, early 60s, and into the 60s. But your family was truly incredible. And I think they play such a big part of who you are today.
Well, yes, and my family really protected me during those years by, I grew up on an 80-acre farm just outside of...
In the suburbs.
Well, yeah, so yeah, on a hot 2-lane blacktop road.
Yes.
And it was a place of refuge for us.
Mhm.
And when I tell people I have this idyllic Southern childhood, and they say, you're Black, and it's from the 60s, how could you have that? And my parents really wanted us to have this normalcy about us, and in spite of a time that was not normal at all.
Right.
But the civil rights movement was always kind of around the corner from us in some way. It was in the periphery, and you get to a certain point where you can't really continue to look away.
Yeah. The Sovereignty Commission and their files. That ends up becoming a big part of your family history, and something you probably didn't expect, did you?
No, it's not what I expected at all. When I learned my parents' names were in the file, I had a slight germ of an idea that I'd come to Mississippi, start to research this, and think about a narrative history of the Sovereignty Commission, one that the various people who were involved in its creation and development, they would be the characters. I didn't see myself as a character. So it's something I often share with my students. We don't really think about how often our personal histories are wrapped up in the broader history of the place where we're living at that time. And that's something that I've come to realize once I got into the files and realized how closely my family's history was wrapped up in the civil rights history of the state. I became part of the story rather than I couldn't be this outsider, this omniscient narrator who's not a part of it. I was really a part of it.
How did your first book, Ever's a Long Time, that was kind of born from the fact that your children who did not live in Mississippi asked you about Mississippi?
Right, and at that time they hadn't even been here.
Wow.
So that was... So for me, it was them asking me what Mississippi's like, and my not really knowing what to say, to be honest with you. I didn't know what to say, so I had to start figuring it out. So all these stacks of books start to show up around the house from reading about Mississippi, and then I remember the day I came back. It was November 11th, 1998. That was my first day back in Mississippi in almost a decade. And then the next day I was in the archives doing research. And that's really how it all got started.
That's how it got started. So your parents were in the Sovereignty Commission's file. Why?
Well, lots of people end up in the Sovereignty Commission files. My father was a county agent, the Negro county agent.
Yeah, because he didn't make the same pay.
No, did not make the same pay.
Yeah.
And the county agents and home economists have begun to have integrated meetings. A letter went to Governor Barnett, and they were investigated and all put in the files. Teachers were routinely put in the files. My mother was a teacher. But what I found in the correspondence was how the state, how the county superintendent of education was involved with that, and then digging deeper into the files, realizing that he was a Ku Klux Klan member at the time as well.
Wow.
So kind of connecting the dots. You see a name in the file, and what I was trying to do is, well, how did the name actually get there? What's the backstory to it all? And so for every story, there's always a backstory.
Right.
So that's really what I was looking for, is a lot of backstory, my own back pages.
Both your parents very educated, and education was a big part of your life.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And what inspired you to become a writer? Because originally, didn't your dad wanted you to become a doctor?
Oh, my dad wanted me to be a doctor.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I
mean, whose dad doesn't want him to be a doctor? I mean, come on.
I know, but I think it's very common in African American families. The first generation that's educated, they want more for the next generation. And my father saw the professions,
Yeah.
being a lawyer or a doctor. That was the next step. Being a writer was not something, or an editor. It's not something my parents could imagine. My parents are both Tuskegeans. They're practical people.
Right.
So, but I wrote a paper for John Cruz at Ole Miss, and I can't remember what I wrote the paper on, and he read it and he said, "This is really good. Now tell me why you're a pre-med major."
Wow. And that was the moment that changed your life.
Yeah, it really changed things for me. I mean, to be honest, I did kind of keep the ruse going. I had a dual major in psychology and English, just so that my parents would think that I was still doing something practical.
The psychology thing you could use to kind of do the mind trick on your dad, right?
Right. But it's interesting. In graduate school in English, my professors did notice how much of my literary analysis was based in psychology. So.
Well, I mean, so you went to Ole Miss and everything, but at that point, that's when you kind of went away from the state because you went to graduate school at
University of Michigan.
That's right. And that's a little bit different in Mississippi. A little colder in the wintertime.
It is. And I have to say, my arrival in Ann Arbor in 1978, I tell people it's the first time I felt I was at a place where I really belonged.
Right.
And but
that's a powerful statement.
Yeah, I felt I really belonged there. But now, looking back on that, well into middle age,
yes,
and thinking about, because I remember being there saying, why wasn't I here 4 years ago? Why did I start here? And then I think about where I came from and going back to visit that farm.
Yeah.
And from the path from Ann Arbor, from Mount Olive to Ann Arbor, is not a direct one. You have to take a lot of steps along the way. It was a big step for me. And I actually, right before I went to Ann Arbor, I spent the summer in England and Ireland, just kind of wandering around. I desperately wanted to see the rest of the world, and that's what I set out to do.
You have kids that are kind of doing that now. Your children
Yes,
are doing that same thing, and so you did that. And so, how hard is it for you not to want your kids to become doctors too?
It hasn't been as hard as I thought it would be.
And they're very talented, I might add.
Thank you. They are very talented, but I know that there are certain things that I would like for them to do, but they have their own path. At a certain point, as a parent, as you know, you realize you no longer have any influence. That it's up to them, and it's their life.
Right.
As my son once said to me, "You've already been to college." And, I have to. This is my decision. This is my choice, and that was the right thing for him to say to me. It was, "Dad, back off."
Right.
And at a certain point, it's an important step, and then you realize you have to start thinking about your child in a different way.
I tell you, that's the hard part, because everybody always asks me, do your kids draw? Well, none of my kids draw. In fact, I think if they start drawing, I'd smack their hands with a ruler. But I think my job as a parent is to see their talents and to help grow them as much as possible. And that sounds like what you're doing.
Yes, I think with a lot of help from my wife, because I would really love to. I would love to direct them in one way, and she's always saying no.
And she's busy directing you at the same time, right?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So Michigan. So what was the next step for Michigan? Because I mean, things started happening pretty quickly from that point.
Yes. Well, when I went to Michigan, I thought that I wanted to get my doctorate in English, and I got a little bit scared by it all.
Really?
Yes,
That doesn't strike me. You don't seem like somebody would ever be nervous about such a thing.
I was. I mean, it was. I think it was because I saw a cover of the New York Times Magazine about why is this man driving a cab, and it has someone with a PhD.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'll take a little time off and maybe I'll go back. And I started to work in publishing in Washington, and I never went back.
How did you get to Washington?
My sister was in law school at Georgetown.
Okay.
And I slept on her sofa while I found a job, and I started working in publishing in Washington. And I thought, well, maybe I'll stay here a little while. Maybe I'll go back to grad school. Maybe I'll move to New York. I always thought I'd be moving to New York to work in publishing. And I never left. And as a result, once the chance for me to work at the Library of Congress came up, and I was doing a lot of co-publishing there with publishers in New York, and was basically spending maybe about half the month in New York. It was kind of like I was doing what I set out to do when I came to Washington in the first place, was to really work in the more commercial world of publishing rather than on the scholarly side of things, which is where I started my career, and that was a big shift for me.
I've always said I wanted to research in the main hall of the Library of Congress because you just feel smarter when you're in that building. Working at the Library of Congress for you, that had to be incredibly close to a dream job.
It was very much a dream job because you have everything there. You have
literally.
There's the resources are endless, and for an editor and publisher, the sources for books are endless. I had this imaginary bookshelf of all the books that I want to do from the collections of the library. And in my 18 years there, I did not fill the bookshelf. I did developed about 100 titles in my time there. But there's still more and more for me to learn about, to do. I learned so much from our curatorial staff, from the librarians. And I think in a lot of ways, they helped me along the way as a writer, because there's a lot that they taught me about doing archival research that made a difference when I started working on my books.
Second book, House at the End of the Road. And I will say this about your writing style. As a writer myself, I read your work, and it's one of those that not only am I love the story you're telling, but how you tell it. How did you develop your style?
From reading.
Reading?
I read a lot, and as my students will tell you, I sign a lot of reading. But I do believe that reading makes you a better writer. Very often when I am writing, I read a lot of poetry just to kind of get an idea of language, and because I'm looking for a word or a way to express something. And poets have this economy of expression, and they also know how to make words really sing. And I get a lot of inspiration from them. And a lot of writers say they can't read other writers. I write exclusively nonfiction, but I do turn to other nonfiction writers, especially the work of Joan Didion, because I think she's such an amazing storyteller and has an interesting point of view.
Right.
And I learn a lot from reading her work.
I think too, one way to describe your writing, you paint pictures, and you do it very well. Is that something that you try to do?
It is something that I try to do. And I think that sometimes, when I do have to have the visual in front of me to kind of paint that picture sometimes. So often I have a camera with me, because if it's something that I know that I'm going to write about, I want to make sure I get all the detail right. I think I have a pretty good memory. I'm not like Eudora Welty, who had that amazing memory where she could remember every last detail. I need some cues every now and then to remind me of some things, and the visual really helps. And I think it's probably easier now that things are digital.
Exactly. About to say, I remember I used to have a clip file this thick of pictures that I draw. Now I can just Google it. So it does make it easier. Talk about your writing style. I'm just always kind of interested on the creative process for creative people. Do you have a writing studio per se, and do you write at a certain time every day?
I don't have a writing studio. I did in my old house. Since we downsized, now I write wherever I can, and that's something that I've had to learn to do just in the last few years. Is learn to be able to shut things off and write wherever I can. I work best in the mornings. The morning is my time to write. When I was working on both of my books, I prefer to work in the mornings, revise in the afternoons. That was kind of the way that I worked. A lot of Ever is a Long Time was done nights and weekends. I had time off to write The House at the End of the Road. So I had a routine where basically I would get dressed. I really, I had an office down the hall. I went in there and I worked, and I knew, there was no email, the blinds were down. So I wasn't looking outside, and I just wrote.
You talk about that time off. You're very modest about how you just said that. Explain how you manage that time off, because it's got a great story behind it.
Well, I applied for a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation.
Yes.
I had a Guggenheim fellowship and plus a fellowship from the New America Foundation, and both of those
Help keep the lights on.
they kept the lights on while I was off.
You've written so much about Mississippi's past, and you're part of it, and then you've been away, and then you've come back. And it's now 2016. You've been at Millsaps. You've been teaching. You're going to continue to get to do that, which I think is fantastic because you obviously did okay because they've invited you back. I would like to get your impressions of where we are in Mississippi today because we've had a lot of legislation recently that has restoked some passion and so forth. And I just want to get your impression of how far we've come.
I think we've come a long way, but I feel that there are forces now that are trying to push us back a little bit.
Right.
There's a lot of change going on in the country right now.
Yes.
And Mississippi can't close itself off from that change.
Right.
I mean, we began our time as a closed society right at Reconstruction in the 1890s. We broke that apart in the 60s. We developed a whole biracial, political system that we had, and now we're starting to move away from that. And seeing us kind of moving away from a biracial governing coalition to one that is heavily partisan and is heavily racialized in its division concerns me a great deal.
And now the younger generation, do you see any change in that, or do you think that, like you said, that we're going to probably have to go another 20 years before we get that change?
I see some change among the younger generation. I think my concern about the younger generation is I don't feel they have that connection to Mississippi's past, particularly our civil rights history, that they should have, because if you have that connection to it, you're not going to make the same mistakes moving forward.
Right.
And when I've spoken in high school classrooms around the state, and even my own students at Millsaps, very few of them know anything about the Sovereignty Commission. And I think that students in the state should know more than I did when I was growing up here.
That's a good point. And a lot of times I'll show a cartoon of Kirk Fordyce, which wasn't that long ago, and they think it's Herbert Hoover. It's just like, wow, okay. Of course,
I mean, I've noticed that we have these really great Freedom Trails signs around Mississippi now, and on my runs in downtown Jackson, I stop and read a few of them rather than just running by them.
Right.
But I think
you just need to rest. I know the truth.
Yeah, it's the truth.
I'm about to say
that's exactly what it is. I need the rest, but I think we run past them, we drive past them, we don't really soak up the history that's there, and I'm afraid we're becoming a little too distant from that past. I know there are a lot of people who would say, why do you keep bringing that stuff up? I think the reason I keep bringing it up is because we're still wrestling with some of the same issues. They've just taken a different guise now, and we've got to look at them through that lens to keep from making the same mistakes we made 50 years ago.
Right. You threw out a term at me one time we were running called learned helplessness. You think that's a problem in Mississippi, don't you?
I do think that's a problem in Mississippi, that we've been pushing for certain changes for such a long time and keep getting pushed back. No one thinks anything can ever change. And that's how I think a lot of us feel about our state flag. We feel that can never change. And it can change. It's just that we have to learn to push back against it and make sure that we can make the change and make people understand the importance for that change. I mean, we shouldn't have a flag that really excludes 40% of our population.
Right. What's next for Ralph Eubanks?
Well, I'm hoping to continue to write and teach. I'm hoping that I can base my next book in Mississippi. So I've spent my first book in Mississippi, my second one in Alabama. I've come back home here to teach. I think it's time to come back home here and write about this place again.
You talk about change and everything, and of course, in your second book, you talked about your grandfather. Where was his portrait kept?
His portrait was kept in a closet when I was growing up.
And why is that? Because I think that's a great story.
Well, because when you're growing up in Mississippi at the time, in the 60s, you couldn't claim kinship with a white person. And the Sovereignty Commission sent investigators around for that, looking on the half moons on black people's fingernails to see if they actually, on people's fingernails to see if they had black blood in them. And
that was the first time I'd ever heard that. So I was like, okay.
But it stayed in the closet. And then later on, as things progressed, my mother decided to hang it in the house, and then eventually she gave it to me. It was almost as if there was a message saying, here, I know you're really interested in him. You should have this for your own. And now it hangs in my house with a portrait of my other grandfather as well. So they're there side by side now.
Ralph, this has been a pleasure, and it's always good to get a chance to talk to you.
Well, good to talk with you too.
Any other final thoughts before we go?
No, but I'm just really happy to be back in Mississippi. It's good to be home.
It's good to have you back home.
Thanks,
Ralph.